Fellowship. In the late 60s and mid-70s, Jim worked with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, first as a Vietnam program coordinator and later as the editor of the Fellowship magazine. In 1977 through 1988, Jim was Secretary General of the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is how he eventually landed in the Netherlands, where he lives today. He's sitting in New Jersey, I believe. In 1968, while Jim was working as Vietnam Program Coordinator of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, he and 13 others, mainly Catholic clergy, broke into 9 Milwaukee draft boards, removing and burning some of the files in a nearby park while holding a prayer service. Most of these activists, known as the Milwaukee 14, served 13 months in prison for this action. More importantly, Jim had a long-term friendship with Thomas Merton, who dedicated a book to him entitled Faith and Violence. Please help me bring Jim, virtually, his award. Again, this is the award that Ann designs every year. So, Jim, I can explain it to you, but we're going to send it to you.
Of course, I've seen pictures of it in past time. How beautiful. Stained glass, I think, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. Wow. Oh, dear. Well, you'll have to reorganize the living room. Thank you. Goodness, I'm speechless. Okay. But fortunately, I haven't written. Why don't I just say thank you? Thank you for the award. I don't deserve it. I really don't. But it will be a beautiful thing to have. My children will appreciate it. Maybe they'll be more impressed with their father. Some advice from Thomas Merton is never untimely. During an interview I had last week with Pittsburgh journalist Peter Smith, I remarked that Thomas Merton is like a city with 12 gates. There are so many points of entry in Merton's life and thought. Merton as writer, just to start off. Merton as artist, Merton as poet, Merton as photographer, Merton as prophet, Merton as friend, Merton as monk, Merton as hermit, Merton as teacher, Merton as partner in inter-Christian dialogue, Merton as partner in inter-religious dialogue. And of course, Merton as peacemaker. There's 12 gates, and I don't think it'll take very much effort to add another 6 or even another 12 gates to the city and make it 24. When I first met Merton, I was part of the Catholic worker community in New York City. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the correspondence that began then and continued to the end of his life. Let's start off, though, with Merton's roots. It's not surprising that war and peace were major topics for Merton. He was born in France on the last day of January 1915, just 6 months after the start of World War I. In its battlefields and trenches, soldiers were dying by the thousands every day. Among the lesser consequences of that war was its impact on the Merton family. It tore their hopes and plans to shreds. Owen and Ruth Merton were expatriate artists who had made their home in the French Pyrenees. Though a New Zealander, Owen would have been subject to French military conscription had he stayed. No exceptions were made for foreigners or conscientious objectors like him. In the summer of 1916, Owen, Ruth, and their infant son Tom left France for the United States, settling not far from Ruth's parents on Long Island. It must have been a hard adjustment for Owen. The vast majority of Americans had a severe case of war fever Men like Owen, who opposed the war, were widely regarded as traitors and cowards, but at least non-citizens like Owen were not conscripted. Now, ordinarily death is a remote concept for children, but this wasn't the case for Thomas Merton. When he was 6, death came all too brutally when he experienced the death of his mother from cancer. He was only 6 years old. And when he was 9, just 2 weeks before his 15th birthday, his father Owen died in the London hospital of a brain tumor. Not quite 15, Merton became an orphan. But about the same time, Merton began to think for the first time about alternatives to war. He became an admirer of Gandhi and his nonviolent campaign against British rule in India. Rarely one to be part of any majority, Tom took Gandhi's side in a formal debate at Open, his English school, arguing that India had every right to demand Britain's withdrawal. Merton's side of the debate was easily defeated, but for the rest of Merton's life it was to remain an advocate of Gandhi's form of struggle. What Gandhi called satyagraha, the power that comes from seeking the conversion of opponents rather than their destruction, or in a word, nonviolence. Merton did a year at Clare College at Cambridge, then moved to his grandparents' home near Manhattan, where he matriculated at Columbia. Like any university student of that period, he was in a whirlpool of radical political movements, communism, socialism, anarchism, etc., etc. Looking for deeper waters, Merton's search took a religious turn. He was soon on his way to Catholic Christianity. In 1938, with his baptism in Corpus Christi Church in Manhattan, in the neighborhood of Columbia University, Merton crossed the most important border of his adult life. For the rest of his life, every question was to be viewed in the light of Christ. Now, the following year, 1939, World War II began in Europe, though it would be another 2 years before the United States became part of it. German bombs were falling in Britain, which only recently had been his home, and where he was still a citizen. What was remote to most Americans was familiar ground to Merton. The question of how to respond, and if and when the United States joined the war was a subject of many long-running, late-night conversations that Merton had with such friends as Bob Lax and Ed Rice. For Merton, it was a question that had to be regarded not just in political and theological terms, as a theory, but in terms of Christian discipleship. This led him to formulate a response, conscientious objection, that for an American Roman Catholic at that time was unusual, to say the least. Here is how he put it in his autobiography, The 7th-Story Mountain, published 3 years after the war ended. I quote, "God was not asking me to judge all the nations of the world, or to elucidate all the moral and political motives behind their actions. He was not demanding that I pass some critical decision to find the innocence and guilt of all those concerned in war. He was asking me to make a choice that amounted to an act of love for His truth, His goodness, His charity, His gospel. After all, Christ did say, 'Whatsoever you have done to the least of these my brethren, you did to me.'" Now keep in mind that in that period, the patriotism of American Catholics was still regarded as suspect by the Protestant majority. Catholics bent over backwards to make clear their gratitude for having found a home in America. One could find the slogan, as I do right here in Red Bank, New Jersey, where I am this evening, right over the doors of many Catholic church schools, "Pro Deo et Patria," for God and country. Catholics were outshining their neighbors and doing whatever was required to be seen as good Americans. Merton, however, wasn't thinking of social acceptance, but rather trying to make choices that resembled those he believed Christ would make. Christ was not a nationalist. Christ waved no flags. Christ joined no armies. Christ killed no one. Christ never blessed any of his followers to kill. Christ was merciful to all who sought his mercy. Christ accepted execution without resistance, and rising from the tomb, he buried them. Should Christ's disciples recenter their lives on the grave? Merton said no. If Merton's convictions regarding war were unusual, so were the basic vocational issues he was wrestling. People like Dorothy Day inspired him. While teaching at St. Bonaventure's in upstate New York, he regularly traveled back to Manhattan to work as a volunteer at a house of hospitality in Harlem. It was in this period that he went on retreat at the Trappist Monastery in Kentucky and found himself powerfully drawn to monastic life. He found it extremely difficult to choose between a life shaped by works of mercy and a life centered in prayer, which these two paths suggested. House of hospitality, Dorothy Day, Catholic worker, Friendship House, the Abbey of Gethsemane, and its austere, almost medieval life in the other. At last he made the defining choice of his life, to be a monk. Perhaps the war was a factor. His draft status had just been changed. He was no longer classified as physically unfit. In those days, few draft boards were willing to recognize Catholics as conscientious objectors. His arrival at the Abbey of Gethsemane occurred just 2 days after the U.S. declared war on Japan and a day before the declaration of war with Germany. But as a monk, he would be exempt from military service. Once he was within a supposedly unworldly monastic enclosure, one might have thought Merton would have lost interest in the issue of war. Not so. Writing his autobiography 6 years after becoming a monk, war was among his topics, and what he had to say in that regard was not at all what Catholics were used to hearing. There were the many paragraphs about what had led him to conscientious objection before becoming a monk. Then a year later, 1948, by which time he'd been in the monastery 7 years, there was a chapter in his next best-selling book, Seeds of Contemplation, that had the remarkable title of this particular chapter, The Root of War is Fear. This was one of the very few essays Merton was to write twice. In 1961, he revised and expanded the chapter for inclusion in new Seeds of Contemplation. In fact, it was in connection with this revised text that my own correspondence with Merton had its genesis. I was a young volunteer at the Catholic worker community in Manhattan, who had just a few months before been discharged from the Navy as a conscientious objector. Merton had sent his new version of The Root of War is Fear to Dorothy Day for possible use in Catholic work. Well, of course, it was immediately accepted. It was his first submission, other than a poem, to a paper that was known for its passionate opposition to war. Dorothy passed along Merton's manuscript to me. I was become that managing editor, asking that I insert subheads and prepare the essay for publication. In a preface to that essay, written especially for the Catholic worker readers, Merton argued that the current war crisis was not God's doing, but was entirely of our own making. In Reasons for War, he wrote, the world was plunging headlong into destruction. This was, he said, true war madness, which Merton saw as an illness of the mind and spirit that is spreading with a furious and subtle contagion all over the world, with no country more afflicted than America. On all sides of the road we have people building bomb shelters where in case of nuclear war they will simply bake slowly instead of burning quickly or being blown out of existence in a flash. And they are prepared to sit in these shelters with machine guns with which to prevent their neighbor from entering. All the while, he said, we claim to be fighting for religious truth, freedom, and other spiritual values. Truly, we have entered the post-Christian era with a vengeance. He then asked, what is the place of the Christian in all this? Is he simply to fold his hands and resign himself for the worst, accepting it as the inescapable will of God and preparing himself to enter heaven with a sigh of relief? Or, worse still, should he take a hard-headed and practical attitude about it and join in the madness of the war makers? Well, he went on to ask the question, what are we to do? The duty of the Christian, he said, in this crisis, is to strive with all his power and intelligence. I have a cat here that I have to stop now. The duty of the Christian in this crisis is to strive with all his power and intelligence to do the one task which God has imposed upon us in the world today, and that task is to work for the total abolition of war. Unless war is abolished, he wrote, the world will remain constantly in a state of madness and desperation, always on the verge of catastrophe. Unless we set ourselves to this task, we tend by our very passivity and fatalism to cooperate with the destructive forces that are leading inexorably to war. It's a problem of terrifying complexity and magnitude, for which the Church itself is not fully able to see clear and decisive solutions. Yet she must lead the way on the road to the nonviolent settlement of difficulties and towards the gradual abolition of war as the way of settling international or civil disputes. Christians must become active in every possible way, mobilizing all their resources for the fight against war. I'm not going to read more of the essay. You'll find, I think, most of it, if not all of the introductory material that Merton wrote, especially with the Catholic Worker in the booklet that's being given to you tonight. So I recommend, if you have time later on, to take a closer look. In this expanded version of his essay, Merton crossed the border, no longer simply confessing his personal sins of being called to renounce violence, but appealing to others to play a collective role in opposing any reliance on the use of weapons of mass destruction. More than that, he called on his readers to take nonviolent methods seriously as a practical and effective way of battling evil. Now, of course, Merton was stepping on thin ice. I mean, those of you who are a bit on the, I'm in my mid-70s now. Those of you who are thereabouts will certainly remember the climate of the Cold War and how easily one got into quite a lot of trouble for saying such things. Merton got into a great deal of trouble. There were those in his own, even in his religious order, certainly among the bishops, who were outraged to see Merton focusing on the highly controversial issue of war. And the sacred cow, it really was a sacred cow of America's nuclear arsenal. You may recall, some of you, that a popular slogan at that time was "the only good bread is a dead bread." The early months of 1962 involved a great deal of great effort on Merton's part to write a book on the issues of war and peace that he hoped would be regarded as moderate enough to pass inspection by his order's censors. He christened the book "Peace in the Post-Christian Era." The manuscript had just been completed when he received a letter from his abbot general, Dom Gabriel Sorte, ordering him to abandon all writing projects having to do with war. A few days after he received this order, Merton wrote to me, again quoting from a much longer letter, "Now here is the axe. For a long time I've been anticipating trouble with the higher superiors, and now I have it. The orders are no more writing about peace. In substance, I'm being silenced on the subject of war and peace." The decision, Merton said, reflected an astounding incomprehension of the seriousness of the present crisis in its religious aspect. It reflects an insensitivity to Christian and ecclesiastical values, and to the real sense of the monastic vocation. The reason given is that it's not the right kind of work for a monk, and that it falsifies the monastic message. Imagine that. The thought that a monk might be deeply enough concerned with the issue of nuclear war to voice a protest against the arms race is supposed to bring the monastic life into disrepute. Man, I would think that it might just possibly salvage a last shred of repute to an institution that many consider dead on its feet. That is really the most absurd aspect of the whole situation, that these people insist on digging their own graves and erecting over it the most monumental kind of tombstone. Beneath the surface of the disagreement between Merton and his abbot general and other monks who had been pressuring the abbot general to give such an order was a different conception of the identity and mission of the Church. In his letter, Merton stated, "The vitality of the Church depends precisely on spiritual renewal, uninterrupted, continuous indeed. Obviously, this renewal has to be expressed in the historical context, and will call for a real spiritual understanding of historical crises and evaluation of them in terms of their inner significance. In other words, the reestablishment of the kingdom of God. The monk is the one supposedly attuned to the inner spiritual dimension of this. If he hears nothing, and if he says nothing, then the renewal of the whole will be in danger and may be completely sterilized. Perhaps the most revealing part of this letter is what Merton said regarding his decision to obey. He asked if he shouldn't just blast the whole thing wide open or walk out and tell them to jump in the lake. After all, when he would say that he would be perfectly justified in disobeying manifestly unjust orders. But Merton was convinced that a great many people would only find scandal in an act of disobedience, and that public denunciation of the abuse of authority, far from being seen as a witness for peace and for the truth of the Church, would be seen by his fellow monks and many others as an excuse for dismissing a minority viewpoint. For many outside the Catholic Church, it would be regarded as fresh proof that the Catholic Church has no love for conscience, private conscience, whose mind, in fact, would be changed. Whose mind would be changed? This was the big question for Merton. For Merton, peace work was an ongoing effort to change the minds of those who are resigned to war, as resigned as their ancestors were resigned to slavery. Merton wrote me soon after that he wasn't altogether pleased with peace in the post-Christian era anyway. It had been written with a constant eye to what might be allowed through official channels. What a mess one gets into, he said, trying to write a book that will get through the censors and at the same time say something I wanted to say. I was bending in all directions to qualify every statement and balance everything off, so I stayed right in the middle and perfectly objective, at the same time trying to speak the truth as my conscience wanted to be said. I don't know if it's among the books available there in Pittsburgh where you are tonight, but it's a book I would recommend to you, despite some Merton's criticisms. In fact, it was an excellent book, and thank God. It was at last published in 2004 by Orpus, but 4 decades had passed before it reached the light of day. I'm sad to say that if you were to read the book, you would find it remarkably timely even after 40 years delay. Even then, the unfiltered Merton continued to write about war and peace, but using pseudonyms under quite thin cover. One piece in the Catholic Worker was signed Benedict Monk. And to those acquainted with Merton's delight in clownish names, who but Merton would sign himself Marco J. Frisbee? He was also allowed by his abbot. To privately circulate a mimeographed edition of Peace in the Post-Christian Era. I helped to distribute it to various people. One copy ended in the White House, another copy reached Pope John the 23rd. Apart from prayer, for several years, the only door that remained open for Merton to write freely about the banned topic of war and peace was in person-to-person correspondence. Through correspondence, Merton was able to act as a pastor to would-be peacemakers. And I say would-be because I think none of us could dare to call ourselves peacemakers, but we might say we're apprentice peacemakers. We're attempting to become peacemakers. Or as a friend of mine used to say, we're attempting to be servants of peace. Merton was a spiritual father, as such people are called in the Orthodox Church. Certainly he was for me. When I reread the letters he sent me, and there are about 50 pages of them included in a book called The Hidden Ground of Love, a collection of Merton's letters. When I look at them again, one of the things I find most striking is how free they are from jargon. Merton was not an ideological person. He was allergic to slogans, whether religious or political. Neither was he self-righteous. Putting his own pacifism to the side, he didn't deny the possibility that wars might have been might exist in the past that fit within the stringent requirements of the just war theory. When warfare didn't, of its nature, inevitably lead to the killing and wounding of countless non-combatant casualty people. But as he wrote Dorothy Day, in today's world, the issue of the just war, quote, is pure theory. In practice, all the wars that are happening are shot through and through with evil, falsity, injustice, and sin. So much so that one can only with difficulty explicate the truth that might be found here and there in the causes for which the fighting is going on. Neither did Merton insist that a Christian was obliged to be a conscientious objector. Yet, he wrote, the highest form of Christian discipleship was the renunciation of violence. As he wrote in another of his books, Seeds of Violence, the Christian does not need to fight, and indeed it is better that he should not fight. For insofar as he imitates his Lord and Master, he proclaims the Messianic kingdom has come and bears witness to the presence of the Kyrios Pantokrator, Greek term meaning the Lord of creation, in mystery, even in the midst of the conflicts and turmoil of the world. Merton may have been a pacifist, that is, someone attempting to live a peaceful, nonviolent life, but he was not a pacifist. Passivity in the face of evil was not a Christian option. Evil must be actively opposed, and it was this that drew him to people like Gandhi, Dorothy Day, and Martin Luther King. Despite his physical distance from the centers of protest activity, Merton was quite able to relate to those in the thick of protest thanks to his vivid memories of of equivalent protest activities from his student days at Columbia University in New York City. As he put it in one letter, I have the feeling of being a survivor of the shipwrecked 30s, one of the few who has kept my original face before the present world was born. What he found often missing among protesters was compassion. Those involved in protests tend to become enraged when they see, with those they see as being responsible for injustice and violence, and even toward those who uphold the status quo while at the same time viewing themselves as models of what others should be. The problem of self-righteousness, I'm sure we've all wrestled with it. We've seen it in others and we may have seen it in ourselves. But without compassion, Merton pointed out, the protester tends to become more and more centered in anger, becomes a whirlpool of self-righteousness, and even becomes an obstacle to changing the attitudes of others, rather than someone who helps open the door to conversion. As he put it in another letter, we have to have a deep, patient compassion for the fears and irrational mania of those who hate or condemn us. These are, after all, the ordinary people, the ones who really don't want war, the ones who get it in the neck, the ones who really want to build a decent new world, and in which the world in which there will be no war and starvation. Most people, Merton pointed out, are irritated or frightened by agitation even when it protests something, for example, militarism, nuclear weapons, social injustice, which objectively endangers them. As he wrote in another letter, people do not feel it by the bomb, but they feel terribly threatened by some student carrying a placard. When compassion and love are absent, Merton insisted actions that are superficially nonviolent can mask deep hostility, contempt, and the desire to defeat and humiliate an opponent. As he wrote in one of his most profound and insightful letters, this will be 2 paragraphs of this. One of the problematic questions about nonviolence is the inevitable involvement of hidden aggressions and provocations. I think this is especially true when there are elements that are not spiritually developed. It's an enormously subtle question, but we have to consider the fact that in its provocative aspect, nonviolence may tend to harden opposition and convert people from their righteousness, and their righteous blindness. It may even, in some cases, separate people out and drive them in the other direction, away from us, away from peace. Well, this may, of course, be, as it was with the prophets, part of God's plan, pure separation of antagonists. But we must always direct our action toward opening people's minds and eyes to the truth. And if they are blinded, we must try to be sure we did nothing specifically to blind them. Yet there is that danger, the danger one observes subtly in tight groups like families and monastic communities, where the martyr for the right sometimes thrives on making his persecutors terribly and visibly wrong. He can drive them in desperation to be wrong, to seek refuge in the wrong, to seek refuge in violence. In our acceptance of vulnerability, we play on the guilt of the opponent. There is no finer torment. This is one of the enormous problems of our time. All this guilt and nothing to do about it, except finally to explode and blow it all out, that hatreds, race hatreds, political hatreds, war hatreds. We, the righteous, are dangerous people in such a situation. We have to be aware of the awful sharpness of truth when it is used as a weapon. And since it can be the deadliest weapon, we must take care that we don't kill more than falsehood with it. In fact, we must be careful how we use truth, quote unquote, use truth, for we are ideally the instruments of truth and not the other way around. Merton noticed that peace activists sometimes identify too much with particular political parties. Ideally, peace activities should communicate these liberating possibilities to others, whether they would define themselves as left, right, or center, no matter how locked into a particular specific structure they happen to be. As he wrote in another letter, it seems to me that the basic problem is not political. It is all political and human. One of the most important things is to keep cutting deliberately through political lines and barriers and emphasizing the fact that they are largely fabrications and that there is another dimension. A dimension which politics pretends to arrogate entirely to itself. This is the necessary first step along the long way of purifying human Canadian politics, drawing attention to the human dimension. My most recent book, I don't know if it's there tonight or not, but if it is, I hope one or two of you might take a look at it. It's on the love of enemies, which one might describe as the hardest commandment. As the book's readers will quickly discover, the text owes a great deal to Merton. For him, the love of enemies, that is to say, love of the other, especially love of the opponent, the adversary, was an essential element in breaking the cycle of enmity. I don't mean love as a sentiment, by the way. Love is not driven by emotion, not love as we understand it in a biblical sense. It is very often an act of pure will. Merton regarded love of enemies as being the essence of the Christian life, a proof of one's Christian faith, a sign that one is a follower and an obedient disciple of Christ. The superficial and even illusionary Christianity is one which professes faith in Christ by verbal formulas and external observance, but which in fact denies Christ by refusing to obey his commandment of love. Let me bring these comments to an end by highlighting one of Merton's major insights for any would-be peacemaker, the realization that our efforts to move society in a more compassionate direction are made stronger by not being attached to quick results. His longest letter on this theme, one he sent me when I was on the edge of burnout, has gone on to become known as his letter to a young activist. And I just want to quote 2 paragraphs from that, and hopefully you'll find time in the booklet you'll be receiving tonight to read it in a more complete version. Do not depend on the hope of results. When you are doing an apostolic work, you may have to face the fact that your work will be apparently worthless and even achieve no result at all, if not perhaps results opposite of what you expect. As you get used to this idea, you start more and more to concentrate, not on the results, but on the value, the rightness, and truth of the work itself. And there too, a great deal has to be gone through. As gradually you struggle less and less for an idea and more for specific people. The range tends to narrow down, but it gets much more real. And here comes one of my favorite sentences from Merton's writings. In the end, he said, in the end, it is the reality of personal relationships that saves everything. It's so easy to get engrossed with ideas and slogans and myths that in the end one is left holding the bag empty, there's no trace of meaning left in it, and then the temptation is to yell louder than ever in order to make the meaning be there again by magic. As for the big results, they are not in your hands or mine, but they can suddenly happen, and we can share in them. But there's no point in building our lives in this personal satisfaction which may be denied us and which, after all, is not that important. The great thing, after all, is to live, not to pour out our lives in the service of the many, and to turn the best things into If you can get free from the domination of causes and just serve Christ's truth, you will be able to do more and be less crushed by the inevitable disappointments. The real hope is in something we think we can do, not in something we think we can do, but in God who is making something good out of it in some way that we cannot see. If we can do His will, we will be healthy in this process, but we will not necessarily know all about it beforehand. Well, as you know, Merton didn't live to see the results of his own efforts for peace. The war in Vietnam was raging when he flew to Asia in September 1968. His sudden death by accidental electrocution while attending a monastic conference in Thailand was only weeks away, December the 10th. Surely he would have considered the return of his body to the monastery exactly right in all its details. He crossed the Pacific in an Air Force cargo plane as part of a shipment of the dead, all but himself, American soldiers who had died in Vietnam. Merton's was the only body without a dog tag. I wish I find it lonely listening and not being able to listen to you, just hearing my own voice, but I hope that somehow I can find a way to make this a dialogue. Shall I dial the phone again?
All right, my name's Jim McCarville. I want to thank you for a great presentation tonight. But I really want to thank you. I want to thank Michael Collins for something you did a long, long time ago. I was a 20-year-old man growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, when my draft record suddenly disappeared. I've never had the opportunity to thank anybody. It took about 6 months for the draft board to reconstruct my records, but in that time, I had an opportunity to think about what you did, what Michael Collins and 12 other people I don't know did, and the price you guys had to pay, and what it meant to me and my country. And I wanted to personally thank you because I had the opportunity to reflect on that, to file a conscientious objector status, which was granted, by the way, and to really have an opportunity to live a life not stained by something that would have compelled me to do something I didn't want to do. So I really thank you. My question for you, though, is just as generals are always accused of fighting the last war, I think we as peacemakers are always accused of trying to make peace for the last war. I'm sure you've reflected on this, the kind of trying times that we're facing now, the different situations, much of it our own making of what we're in. But what advice do you have for us today to try to make peace with some of the real challenges we face with ISIS and people that seem very, very determined to make our lives very difficult? And at that, I'd be just very happy to listen to what you have to say.
Racism is not necessarily fruitless. And one of the things I, as a journalist, would recommend thinking about is publishing the stories that are unreported. Get that on the front page of your paper. It's the Post-Gazette, our main paper, yeah. He has a great deal of respect for Peter Smith, our new religion editor on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We need to change the balance of our perception, so how interesting it would be to have on the front page of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette some of these stories that shift that which we're not hearing about. So presenting another kind of journalism on that front page. We lost his, the hotel person here is back, our techie, so maybe we'll get you back.
Jim, thank you for your talk today. It was inspiring. And some of the words that really touched me were those that you referred to from Thomas Merton, talking about the value of personal relationships that redeems everything, and then
in the end, it's the reality of personal relationships that saves everything.
And the need for, advising young activists. And I've been grappling with an issue I'd love for some insight that you may have, both from yourself and from Thomas Merton, about using the principles of deep and slow change, perhaps even resigning ourselves to slow change, but on a deadline that is derived from the laws of physics as they relate to climate change. And I don't have a good answer for that in my heart or my soul or in my physical being, but I thought that maybe this was a place that there would be some wisdom available to people considering those same issues.
My son and daughter-in-law, whose home I'm staying now in New Jersey, are both extremely active in the environmental movement. My daughter-in-law is the director of the New Jersey Environmental Federation, Clean Water, something like that, New Jersey Environmental Federation. And we were just talking last night about the war against the planet Earth that's been going on for many years. There is no borderline really between our concern with human beings that are being killed and the planet which is being killed. The acidity of the waters in the ocean are slowly but continually rising. Will come a point where this process is not interrupted. The oceans will no longer sustain a great deal of life. That we, for example, from which oxygen that we breathe is produced, which keeps so many species alive. So when we think about the task of the peace movement, it's very much connected with the task of the environmental movement. The two should be seen as a kind of unity rather than as a division of some kind. When I was in prison during the year 69-70, one of the astronauts on the first moon mission sent me a photograph he had taken of the Earth from space. That was the most astonishing present I ever received in my life. To be among the first to see one of the early photographs of the whole Earth from space, where you realize that there are no borders, that it is a unity. As one of the astronauts on that same mission put it, when you can cover the Earth with your hand, you realize how much we depend on each other. I was astounded to get a gift of such a photograph from a military officer on a mission in which I think the last thing that would be on his mind would be his prisoner in a Wisconsin jail. A prisoner in a cell in Wisconsin. I know I'm not able to set up any kind of timeline, but there has to be a sense of urgency even as we pay attention to Merton's advice not to depend too much on hope of results, because if we do, we may give up extremely valuable work for failure to see those results. But without the urgency that drives us forward, well, the forces of destruction and death will be unimpeded. Yeah, I don't know what else to add to that. I wish that I could. Is it Mark?
Yes.
Yeah. I just about heard you through the microphone there. Nice. I'm going to call you back again, Mark.
Criticism is not necessarily fruitless. And one of the things I, as a journalist, would recommend thinking about is publishing the stories that are unreported. Get that on the front page of your paper. It's the Post-Gazette, our main paper, yeah.
Hello. Hello, Jim. My name is Greg, and I appreciate so many of your insights and your witness. When you were talking about attempting to be a peacemaker, I could say the same thing about, in my case, perhaps some of us, attempting to be a Christian, rather than saying we are Christians, we're attempting to be. My observation and question is about loving your neighbor. My struggle is whenever I think of Dick Cheney. I'm never going to have a personal relationship with Dick Cheney. And even though he has a lesbian daughter, as a gay man, I appreciate that he has, I hope, a sensitivity about that. Well, I hope so. A few days ago, Jon Stewart skewered Dick Cheney about some of his remarks about Iran and President Obama. He did it in some, I don't know if you saw it, but he did it in a very humorous but very telling way, taking on, as you said earlier, an issue that most people wouldn't deal with in the media. And he showed and played back Cheney's past. So there was humor, there was the truth. So I get, in a certain sense, my question is, what part might humor have to confront, like Stephen Colbert did at that luncheon several years ago with Bush there? How much humor, like the fool of the of times with the king, what part can the truth have, and possibly have some sense of humor being integrated in confronting and putting forth the truth?
Yeah. I'm glad to hear that Colbert did what you just described. I'll have to see if I can find it, you know, by Googling it or whatever I need to do to see it on YouTube. Is it on YouTube? I think humor is a tool one has to use very carefully. When it becomes ridicule, it can harden the person in his sense of being violated. If it's, it sounds from what you described as if it was another kind of humor in which not just the audience, but maybe Cheney himself might be challenged by Colbert's approach. Do you think so?
Well, first of all, maybe it was Cheney was confronted by Jon Stewart just recently. Okay, Colbert's was several years ago at the correspondence dinner in which he put forth. Actually, he was also skewering the media for not covering the war invasion of Iraq.
Yeah.
So they're both two different. But
okay, I'd be living on the other side of the ocean 6 time zones away. It puts me at a slight disadvantage in following American media, but Colbert I get to see because my wife loves Colbert, and she occasionally calls me over to look on the screen, and she sees a particular portion of the Colbert program. Stewart I'm unfamiliar with. But I think humor can be part of what we're doing. If somebody has the gift to do it, are there anybody else in the room, you know? Let's do what we can. If you do a front page of an alternative front page of the Post-Gazette, have a political cartoon on the cover that makes people laugh. I don't know what the topic should be, but think about it. I don't know what else to add.
well, thank you.
Criticism is not necessarily fruitless. And one of the things I, as a journalist...
Hi, Jim. My name is Kevin Hayes, and first of all, thank you for being with us tonight through Skype. events like the one we had tonight, at least for myself, I think I'm speaking for many people here, or just an opportunity to get together with people who share the values of peacemaking and share the values of trying to make a difference in the world to be a more peaceful place. So what I want to ask you is, I think I can speak for myself, oftentimes it's difficult, you know, when you do feel marginalized and so out of the mainstream current, which supports materialism, supports militarism. What can you offer, or what do you think Merton offers to each of us in terms of trying to continue on as a peacemaker in a non-peaceful world?
Well, you know, one of the attractions that Thomas Merton had, as one of the reasons that his writings on peace had this extraordinary impact on many people, was that he wasn't only identified with peace as such, but as he was a spokesman for the spiritual life, or life of prayer. One could say the same about Dorothy Day. To the extent that we're seen as having more than one string on our violin, it may help people to find points of entry into other concerns that we have. So that, for example, the Thomas Merton Center will, as it may do, running workshops on the Beatitudes. You know, the 8 Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are they who mourn, etc., etc. Just 8 Beatitudes, it's not so many. That would attract people. Because the Beatitudes are something that not as much as Christians, but any person would be interested in. And when you get to the Beatitude of peacemaking, you have a chance to, which is the 7th of the 8 Beatitudes, you have an opportunity to explore within the context of the Beatitudes what peacemaking means. And it's not something isolated in life, but it's an integral part of life. Or if we did drawing on Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, with whom I worked with for quite some time, to do our own workshops on mindfulness and peacemaking. There are people who would respond to that, and there are probably people in the room tonight who are very familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh's writings and could, for people drawn to a more Buddhist approach, find that challenging place to look at peacemaking from the point of view of mindfulness. How do we live through mindfulness? How do we give through a life of blissful peace? Look, I'm being told by my telephone on lawn just gone off telling me to take my pills, which I will do, but later. I have a kidney years ago, and I have to take pills twice a day, or she says she'll take it back. Okay, maybe that's enough for the moment. Is it Vince?
It's Kevin.
Kevin.
Thank you very much.
Do you need to take your pills right away?
No, there's some give and take.
Okay, thank you very much. You bring me very much back to a time of my youth in opposing the Vietnam War and everything that was associated with that. Thank you. My question is, in the beginning comments of Merton, he said that the genesis of war is really fear. And it very much concerns me. I mean, it almost, the very term war on terror confirms that that is really the issue of our time right now, is our fearfulness and, how it drives everything in the world going on right now, and any insights into how to ratchet down the fear level.
Okay, my son Ben has just arrived and is just discovering that I'm connected to Pittsburgh. Whenever I think about that sentence from Merton, the root of war is fear, that essay that he wrote for New Seeds of Contemplation, and the expanded version he did for the Catholic Worker, I'm reminded of an event that I had with my father. My father was Marxist. He had left the Catholic Church as a boy when his pastor proved to be more of a fascist than a Christian. And yet, he became an atheist, but he became a kind of Catholic atheist. I was excited when Merton's essay appeared in the front page of the Catholic Worker in October 1962, and I sent a copy to my dad to show him that prominent people in the Catholic Church who were thinking about issues of peace, and it wasn't all bingo games and no meetings. So he wrote back a very interesting letter to me. He said, you know, I was very impressed by that. I have heard in Thomas Merton, I know that his books are widely read, and I'm delighted to know that there are Catholic priests of such stature thinking about the issue of war and peace. And I'm very impressed by what he says in the article, but I have to say, as a Marxist, that the root of war is bad economics, not fear. Some years passed, and then he wrote me another letter, which I didn't ever expect to receive, in which he said, I continue to think about Father Merton's essay. I read it again recently, and I want you to know I've come to the conclusion that the root of bad economics is fear. When you start looking at the way fear shapes our life, shapes our choices, shapes the way we see things, shapes what we hear, shapes what we imagine in other people, shapes why we cross the street to avoid this or that person. When you think of how many kids make vocational choices based on fear rather than the love of some particular thing they like to do with their life, fear is incredibly powerful. And we're not talking about the fear of God, we're talking about the fear of what might happen to us in this life if we don't behave or make choices of a certain kind. And very often we imprison ourselves in these fears. So I think it's a big topic for the peace movement. It might be something else that could be addressed programmatically through the work of the Thomas Merton Center.
Thank you.
Jim, I'm sorry I'm kind of short and I wasn't able to get up on the stage. Your comments about fear led me to want to comment on the life work that I've had led out of my involvement with the peace movement many years ago with the anti-Vietnam War movement has led me to an anti-racism movement. And your thoughts about the economy as part of what has happened with us, the inequality that we deal with, the disparity, the fear that we have of one another has led, is a very root, I think, of a lot of the war that continues to go on within our own country, the war against one another, but also the war in most of the other places are rooted in racism and inequality. And I see that as a very grounding for me in terms of my work in anti-racism, and I wonder what you would reflect on that.
It was interesting, just thinking in terms, again, of Merton's life, that one of the major themes, one that I didn't take time to explore in my talk about Merton and peacemaking, was what he had to say about racism in Harlem, because when he was making these huge vocational choices, he was torn between, on the one hand, house of hospitality vocation, on the other hand, monastic life. He became, through his experience in Harlem, very aware in an intense way about racism. And one of the striking things in the story now is the attention that he pays, the passionate writing that he does about racism in that autobiography. When I first became involved with the Catholic Worker, part of our weekly regimen was to go up and, for a certain period of time, we were picketing Woolworths to protest the segregation of the lunch counter in Woolworths student shops in the southern part of the United States. It's somehow holding these threads together in our work, trying to find ways to show the unity of these concerns rather than the disparity. It's very important. I'd love to know more about what you're doing. I'm hoping to see Dan in a couple of days.
Okay.
Because he has ups and downs. He has good days and he has very weak days. We're just sort of Russian roulette how I'll find him. Okay.
And that's why I came.
All right, everybody. It's been very strange having us giving a kind lecture, especially because I was able to hear my voice most of the time. And that's not the way it should be. I hope that the next time I'm in the United States, I can come be fully present in Pittsburgh.
I just wanted to add what Jim was saying about Daniel Berrigan. I got a call a few days ago that he's in very weakened and very bad condition. And so I'm asking you not to take any more time, but to take with you in your heart Daniel Berrigan and the family of Joe Hughes, who's a longtime member of the Merton Center, Uncle Sam Joe, who died this past week. He was on staff at the Merton Center. So if you just carry them with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to move ahead in the program and ask Carol Gonzalez to come forward and just share information about the rest of our festival for Merton.
Yes, well, this is actually the 6th event for the 10-day festival in April. We actually launched on Merton's birthday, January 31st, with 5 events all over the city, praying the Book of Hours, using exclusively Merton's writings. And so that we launched that January 31st. We have 8 more to go. So we're not even halfway done with the festival. So lots more opportunity to share, invite with your, with all those you know who especially reach out, if you haven't already, to a young adult that you would like to introduce Merton to. It's really good to see some young adults here, but we can do more. So I encourage you to do that. The events are listed in your brochure, so I don't need to go through the details. Just to say that it's really diverse, both from the different communities that have invited us to share and collaborate with us in the festival. You'll see that in the various offerings. And it's diverse geographically to just really recognize we want to be where we're planted. So I encourage you to participate in the rest of the festival. We will be wrapping up the end of the year on Merton's death date, December 10th, with a special service, which I won't tell you about, and it'll be a big surprise, but it's going to be glorious. So we really are seriously taking the whole year. I would like at this point just to recognize the people who have planned this year's festival, but especially this 10 days. Those who've been working on this. We're a small committee, but we're mighty. Joyce Rothermel, Sister Georgine Scarpino, Diane McMahon, and Molly Rush. Pardon? On the planning committee, and Rabbi Donsky, and all of the people who collaborated in making this possible. So kudos to everyone. Okay.
So we have 2 more things left in the evening. I'm going to ask Joyce to come up and do our call to membership, and then we're going to end with our auction winners and call it an evening. So thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone, and I hope that you have enjoyed our time together. Some here have been gathering like this, called together by the Thomas Merton Center for 43 years. With the inspiration of our namesake, Thomas Merton, and the support of so many, in so many ways, of the center's members through the years, we have brought the values and mission of the Thomas Merton Center for a more just and peaceful